Polarization feels like either being too scared to say anything or being angry all the time.
For me, polarization is a decrease in trust and respect for the other.
Why would I want to walk with someone who is on the opposite side of the political spectrum from me?
I get deeply worried about polarization when I see people starting to neglect those very things that have kept them together for so long.
What's it going to take to bring us together when it feels like so much is pulling us apart? Welcome to Breakthroughs, a podcast by Search for Common Ground, the world's largest peacebuilding organization. In this show, we reveal the secret to solving tough problems by building collaboration. I'm Lena Slackmulder, and for the last 30 years, I've been working on the front lines of violent conflict. I've seen enemies become allies and overcome their greatest challenges together. In this first season of Breakthroughs, we're biting off a big problem we see pretty much everywhere: polarization. So let's get going.
If you look at some of the major conflicts and events that have happened around the world, fear is actually one of the driving forces behind the actions and the decisions that people make in those conflicts.
That's Dr. Adrienne Lemon, director of the Institutional Learning Team at Search for Common Ground. She's devoted her career to finding out what it takes to build healthy, safe, and just societies and how to measure it. Adrienne, tell me, what do you think is the biggest myth about polarization?
The thing I hear most often is the expectation that it means if we don't have polarization, then we all like each other, or that we're all friends with each other in a society. And that's actually not what polarization is about. It's much deeper than that. What it really boils down to is whether we feel that we share the same expectations, the same understanding of what it means to participate in this society. Are we bought in the same way? And can we trust each other to buy in the same way and to follow the same rules? And when we don't have that, it creates polarization. We perceive other groups as having a very different experience than us, as being totally separate from us. And then there are kind of other things that stem from that: fear, mistrust, etc. And so making sure that we reduce polarization doesn't actually mean that we all just want to get along, which can sometimes seem trite or a little bit oversimplification of the issue.
When I heard you talking, you're using words like fear and it makes us polarized. Is polarization always bad? Sometimes it feels like it's kind of normal that we don't all agree, as you said.
Polarization will happen to varying levels in a society. But if you look at some of the major conflicts and events that have happened around the world, fear is actually one of the driving forces behind the actions and the decisions that people make in those conflicts. The decisions, when you ask people why did they choose to fight, it's not even hatred, it's fear that comes out. And polarization is something that we can look at to understand, are we moving into a conflict? Are we moving into a space where maybe we can't come back as easy? And when we move towards violence, it becomes like a signal of that. So on the one hand, some polarization will always exist in societies, and the goal is not necessarily to get it to absolute zero. But we do have to understand that tells us a little bit about our level of risk, because there is something quite real around polarization that drives the decisions of people.
Is polarization something you can actually measure?
Yes, you can. We don't ask people directly whether they're polarized, but what we do is we look for signals that would give us a sense of whether people are feeling polarized in a society. Do they trust other groups? Do they feel safe to interact with those groups? So there's all kinds of ways that we can break this down into everyday experiences that people can relate to, ask them questions about that, and then get a sense of where we're going in terms of polarization. And we can not only do that on the grand scale, but we can also look at differences between groups. So does the majority of a population feel safe to interact, but maybe there's a small subgroup of people who don't feel that safety and who don't feel protected?
There's something that sounds very scientific when we use this word polarization. And yet, the way to measure it seems to be about asking people, how do they perceive themselves and those around them? Is it that simple?
Yes, it is. Most of science, I think, can be boiled down into these kind of everyday experiences. But polarization is a term that really just encompasses all of these everyday experiences that we're having and that make us feel safe and part of a society or don't. And that's what we're actually trying to get at when we measure this concept.
You're listening to Breakthroughs, a podcast about using collaboration to solve some of our toughest problems. We've all heard stories of historical statues being destroyed when tensions are high or when one group overturns the status quo. It reminds us that how we see our past can be a source of unity, but it can often also drive us apart. Today, I'm talking with Mohammed El Haj, or Mo as he calls himself, who for more than 6 years has been working with Search for Common Ground in his home country of Lebanon on dozens of programs aimed at building social cohesion and preventing violence. So, Mo, when we try and understand polarization in Lebanon, how does the history, heroes, and heritage play out?
The Lebanese people did go through a lot of pain caused from violence, from our civil war, and different conflicts that we lived through. For us, it's something that we try to do. We try to unite the Lebanese people around these feelings, and really, in a sense, try to shed the light on the things, on our shared needs and our shared experiences. Though what happens is that on the ground is that people often try to remember or try to focus on fear of the other and concerns that the other does not really look like them, and base their judgments and decisions around these fears instead of focusing on things that unite us in a sense.
How much do you feel as though people know enough about each other across your society in Lebanon? Do you feel as though they have a sense of each other's, history of what's important to them and the way they think of their past?
Yes, exactly. This is why we started this project called Turati, that translates to my cultural heritage, a project that brings in youth from different areas in Lebanon that do not really look like each other in terms of religious and political affiliations. We wanted, in a sense, to work with these youth to actually understand their own history. We wanted them to learn more about what differentiates them between them and others. Why do they call certain people as enemies? Why do they call other certain people as allies? We wanted them to actually understand their own history to be able to appreciate it.
How did that then become something that could address polarization? What did you do with that new sense of understanding that the young people had about their own heritage?
So after they discovered their own history and their own cultural heritage, what we did next was we did organize exchange visits between the different youth in these different areas. And these are areas that consider each other as enemies or as dividing lines. Yani, on a normal day, people from these areas would not really visit each other. They consider this place really alien to them and really distant to them.
It sounds like you're saying that you were able to get people to go and visit parts of their own country that they had considered no-go zones, because perhaps it was dominated by a political group that they and their parents didn't support over the years. But that with Turati, they were able to, step into new communities that they hadn't understood before. Is there anything that really struck you when that started to happen?
The thing is, not only the youth were hesitant or, in a sense, concerned about these visits, but also the different businesses, the different communities that they were visiting were really surprised to hear from where these youth are coming. So when you have someone in Bikfaya seeing this tour happening in front of their eyes and then approach these people, these youth, and ask them, where do you come from? And they tell them from Sarafand, it's all inspiring. What actually surprised me as well was the sustainability of these initiatives, where after the project, people kept on visiting these areas and they kept on hosting people from different areas as well.
We're talking about a project like this in the context of, polarization, when people begin to see each other so different that they lose a desire to collaborate, that they might be vulnerable to fear. Did you find that simply by going on a community tour and learning about, who created the first school in the community, or what was the first Bell factory in that community, that addressed some of those seemingly harder issues that polarize people across Lebanon?
Definitely. The key component here is not talking about these elements that polarize people, but instead showing people from different areas that their supposed enemies or all the stereotypes they have against other people, they're exaggerated, to say the least.
Some of our listeners might be asking, does this help the political divide? Does this help the sectarian divide that we know is deep in Lebanon? How would you answer that, Mo?
It does help in a sense. It's For me personally, this is the best way forward. Why? Because you'd see a person, a Muslim person, comfortably sitting in a church and going back the second day to his or her friends and telling people that churches are beautiful from the inside. And the other is true as well. Yani when people from Zahli go to Tripoli and say, we've seen beautiful mosques in Tripoli, we've seen things that are places that we can go and comfortably eat in. So when they get back to their communities with these experiences, this does help reduce the sectarian and political divide between people, because politics in itself is something neutral. It can be positive or it can be negative. It depends on the dynamic and the interactions. What we want to do is reduce tensions and reduce conflicts between these political parties. Violent conflicts between these parties.
While you were doing this project around how we can understand our shared heritage, how we can find those bright spots in the hometown of the enemy, as you said, Mo, the Syrian war broke out. And Lebanon was one of the countries that hosted the largest number of Syrian refugees. More than 1 million Syrians fled to Lebanon, a country of just 4 million people. So, with a past of war and occupation between Lebanon and Syria, this created lots of tensions within Lebanon. Tell us a little bit, how did Search for Common Ground in Lebanon try to avoid and mitigate the chances that the Lebanese society would be even more divided at that moment?
What we did first is that we understand that in conflicts, people tend to label others with different bad terms, like other people are dirty, they are filled with diseases and infections. So what we started to do is actually bring the refugees and the people living in Lebanon to actually start meeting together, having a very safe place for dialogue, to actually communicate their different fears and concerns. And out of these dialogue sessions, what we did is bring these different communities together to actually look at what problems do they face and then come up with joint solutions for these problems. So instead of trying to compete with each other, what Search did is actually bring the safe space for them, for different communities, to actually find creative solutions to their problems.
You just said that you created a safe space. It must have been really scary to be invited into a dialogue session with people you think hate you, or people maybe that you also don't like very much. So, how did you get over some of that hesitation of people to engage in these kinds of activities?
It's a very complex process in itself. So it's not as easy as bringing everyone to a town hall meeting and then ask them to talk. We started by using Search for Common Ground's reputation. So people do trust Search for Common Ground, whether they are local leaders, municipalities, or people living in these areas. We did approach decision makers from the refugee community, and we did approach decision makers from the Lebanese community. We talked to them individually, telling them about our aim, our approach, and what we want to do, and how does this fit into reducing tensions in the area and to actually improve their situation in a sense and give them actually a say in what is happening to them. So instead of people just receiving aid and sitting in their homes, with them to actually have a say in what's happening and how do they actually see things moving forward. We do implement a common ground approach. It's a very big tool that we use that starts by actually showing the people working with us the different identities that they have, the beauty of their diversity. What does perspective and perception means? Why do we see each other as competitors? We do delve into these things to actually reach a stage where they start honoring each other's dignity and, in a sense, trying to find solutions for their shared issues.
I hear you talking a lot about leaders. So am I right that when we think about depolarizing communities, we've got to work with leaders only, or how does that work?
I mentioned leaders in here as an entry point, but we do have different entry points and different actually people to work with. So one of our projects right now is with videographers and film students. Another project we had was with artists, with media actors. So when Search for Common Ground works, it does not only work with the community per se, but more of every project has a unique element to it. But what combines all of Search for Common Ground's projects is the way we use media. We work with media as allies. And media is a main overarching component in all our projects. We use media to launch national campaigns and area-specific campaigns to reduce tensions between communities and work with them to actually see others as more of an allies than a competitive.
It's more often than not that we hear pretty devastating news from your part of the world. In addition to the ongoing conflict in Syria, Lebanon's faced a number of challenges over these last few years. And it would seem that that kind of frustration or grievances or people being really angry about things could fuel polarization. Do you feel like the gains of a project like Turati and what you've done with, Lebanese and Syrians has had an effect during these tough times?
So through Search for Common Ground's work in Lebanon, we do actually build trust between the different communities who often see themselves as enemies. And this trust stays till after this project and does help reduce the effect of incidents like burning settlements or incidents of killing or murdering someone from a different nationality. So when these incidents happen, sadly, the mainstream media does focus on the hatred aspect. They focus on how to use this incident to push political messages. So instead, what Search for Common Ground does is actually work with our networks on the ground of youth and communities scattered all over Lebanon to amplify the different narrative that happens after an incident, to shed the light on the people doing good things towards the people affected. So if someone burnt a Syrian refugee settlement, we want to shed the light on the Lebanese people who open their doors and help with first aid or whatever they can, or by giving aid to these affected Syrian refugees. I want to also say that sadly, very violent incidents happen, but there was a possibility for much more to happen. But through working with the different networks in Lebanon, we did actually reduce the amount of fake news, exaggerated news, these messages of hatred spread across the country. We help reduce these messages and reduce the tensions happening after such incidents. And in a sense, a lot more of violence, pillaging, and hatred could have happened, but we did actually work to reduce it.
That's it for this episode of Breakthroughs, a podcast by Search for Common Ground, the world's largest peacebuilding organization. Find out more at sfcg.org and follow us on Twitter at @sfcg_. Thanks for coming along and hope you can join us next time.